Okay, so both of you guys have this, the 60s decade of protest and change. I tried my best to arrange it. All right, y'all. So those of you who are watching this at home, thank you for doing so. What I did is I took a PowerPoint that I've got years ago, and it's much more detailed than you need for STAR, but just enough detail for AP. And I've tried to jazz it up with some videos here and there. Normally, this is a class that I teach for a semester. So I'm going to see how much I can get done. But this is going to go along the chapter 14, the 60s, a decade of protest and change. When you guys look at it, of course, as it says here, it's got your teaks. And then in between the last teaks and important ideas, it says quite easily the 60s were a time of protest and change. But it doesn't start out that way, right? When the 60s start, it's calm like the 50s, right? It's all that conformity and everything. But Kennedy gets our hopes so up. That is, John F. Kennedy gets our hopes so up. And there's nothing like hopes dashed, right? Where you get all excited and then boom. So when Kennedy took office, and you'll see part of this speech, he says the torch is being passed to a new generation. You guys were around for Obama, and I know you were kind of young, but that same kind of excitement, that same kind of hope, literally in Obama's case, as he said, hope and change, was there. And so we see that Kennedy did a lot, of course, in civil rights. He kind of had to be pushed along. If you watch that Saturday presentation that I did, it really took the Freedom Riders nearly being burned to death in a bus to get JFK to finally do things, even though, as you'll see, he campaigned trying to get that. And also, not only will the African American movement get changes for African Americans, voting rights, civil rights, but also other groups. Women will look at also Native Americans and Hispanic Americans as well too. Let's see here. And then, of course, when he's assassinated, President Johnson, LBJ, right? Lyndon Baines Johnson. For some reason, we had to always have, presidents with three initials back in those days. He tries to fight a war on poverty. He tries to give us this great society. But as we'll see, and we may not get to Vietnam today, I may end up doing that tomorrow. But the war in Vietnam is going to be just too expensive, too much, and it's going to turn too many people against President Johnson. And so by the end of the 60s, y'all, and this is when I'm a thinking individual, I'm in first grade, and by the end of the 60s, people are ready to kind of go back to things. In fact, the way they were in some ways. In fact, the 70s will be known as the me generation, where people were more concerned about them and that kind of thing. And also, and I'm not going to do a very good job on it, warning up ahead, I hate to say, if I get a chance, I'll work on it for tomorrow if we don't get as far. But a lot of cool music comes out of this period. You guys can read there the important ideas on your own. Make sure you're aware of all of those. That's very, very important. And then, of course, it takes you all the way through key terms and people in the chapter. I think about the only thing I don't have in the right place is letter N, as in November. I've got the beats where I'm talking about the counterculture, and so it's a little bit out of the way. And that 1950s culture and conformity, which Oscar was saying today, somehow didn't get posted, so I will look. I talked about the beatniks, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, the sort of predecessors to the hippies, the counterculture of the 1960s. All right, so we go to this part here where it says the Kennedy presidency, 1960 to 1963. Now, the 1960 election, when you look at it here, y'all, the big thing it mentions was this was the first campaign in which candidates debated on TV. It was a big thing, and I can't emphasize enough, if you guys are asked to write about the impact of television, especially in the 60s and 70s, this election was decided by television. Richard Nixon, who had been vice president for Dwight Eisenhower for 8 years, was by far was expected to win the election. Nixon had a very inflated opinion of his ability to use television. Remember, he had done the checker speech where he used his dog basically to say, "Look, I never took any money for a slush fund. Only thing we ever took was a dog." He also had been famous for what was called the kitchen debate, where when he traveled to Russia, we had a model kitchen. In other words, the very best, fanciest kitchen that, quote, a housewife could have back then. Dishwashers, washing machines, all kinds of cool ovens and stuff. And Khrushchev came to visit while Nixon was there. And they kind of debated. Nixon was trying to show what American capitalism could do, and Khrushchev kind of blew him off. But a lot of people thought Nixon had done a good job defending himself. All right, so why do I say all that? I say that because when Kennedy said, "Hey, Dick," they were actually good friends, believe it or not. "Hey, Dick, why don't you debate me on TV?" And Nixon's like, "You want to debate me? Sure." Well, the thing is, Kennedy had nothing to lose. Nixon had everything to lose. And in fact, people that listened to it on radio, a lot of people still used radio, thought that Nixon had won the debate. People that saw it, however, saw a very relaxed Kennedy, good-looking guy. He was tanned from, campaigning, and also, as we know, a disease he had, which gave him sort of this golden sort of tan. Nixon had phlebitis. He had lost a lot of weight. He hadn't put makeup on, and so he looked like his face was kind of unshaven. He had this 5 o'clock shadow. So people that watched it on TV, and more people were watching it on TV, thought Kennedy had won. And it was a series of debates. I think there were 4 of them. So it plays a big role. Both of them had very attractive wives. I should mention this, that Mrs. Kennedy had been educated at some of the best schools. She spoke fluent French and she spoke passable Spanish. And she actually did a commercial in Spanish. First time anybody had tried to reach out to Hispanic voters. And I love her Spanish because it's like Mr. D Spanish, really slow, and I can understand it because she says every word carefully, and that kind of thing. The Kennedy people, even though there was actually very few years difference, Kennedy just seemed younger. And Nixon really pushed the fact that he had experience. Don't gamble with our securities. He'd been vice president for 8 years. Kennedy is this young whippersnapper. Kennedy, though, really pushes to get America moving again. That's going to be his big thing. Just some information about Kennedy, more than you guys need to know. He'd been a minor hero in World War II when his PT boat, that is a small patrol boat, got sank, and he saved his crew. He actually had won a Pulitzer Prize. It's not a novel. It's a true story. Sorry about that typo. And this is something that you guys could know. JFK was only the second Roman Catholic we've had run for a major party. Believe it or not, even in 1960, some people were making a deal of that. Some people said a Catholic couldn't be president because a Catholic, listens to the Pope. And how can you be president and maybe listen to the Pope and do what the Pope says rather than what your people say? But believe it or not, Kennedy, right here in H-Town, Bayou City, Houston, Texas, he gave a speech to a bunch of ministers in which he said, "Look, you wouldn't do this to a Baptist. You wouldn't do this to a Buddhist. We can't be bringing religion into this thing." Now, Al Smith had run in 1928 against Hoover and been whooped big time. And so this was a big deal. Today, I hope nobody would like, "Oh, that person's Catholic." Most of us probably couldn't even identify. In fact, Biden, I don't know if you guys know, but Biden is Catholic, right? I don't know if we've had other Catholic presidents since Kennedy or not. I'm just trying to go back through it. But we don't even make a deal of it anymore. So we've come a little ways. Now, the man who ran against him, Richard Nixon, will ultimately be president in 1968. He was a Californian. He was at the time very, very staunchly anti-communist. In fact, that's why Eisenhower picked him. Eisenhower was kind of middle of the road. In fact, both political parties thought they could have Eisenhower. That's how middle of the road he was. Nixon, on the other hand, and this is going to be important later, Nixon had very strong anti-communist credentials. He had gone after the State Department employee Alger Hiss. Nobody thought he could get Hiss. He had found out that Hiss had lied about being a member of the Communist Party, had lied about giving secrets during the Great Depression, and maybe as well during World War II to the Soviet Union. And why is that an important thing? Because in the early 1970s, Nixon is going to be the guy who brings back détente. Détente, D-E-T-E-N-T-E, D-E-T-E-N-T-E. Détente means an easing of tensions. He was able to negotiate deals to reduce the number of nuclear weapons. He went to the Soviet Union. No American president had done that. He went to China. No American president had done that. And he didn't recognize China. We weren't ready for that. That takes a few more years. But he was the first American president to visit it. And in fact, he will play China off against Russia, right? Something I kind of wish we could do. It seems to be kind of going the opposite in Ukraine right now. But, China and Russia were not very good friends in those days. So if we got friendly to China, the Russians said, hey, what can we do to be, your friends again? Well, hey, sign this nuclear deal. And then to the Chinese, well, what can we do? You're becoming really good friends with the Russians. Well, maybe you can help us in Vietnam. Stop aiding the North Vietnamese. Maybe put pressure on them. This is what was known as playing the China card. Nixon, as a Republican, could get away with this. Most Republicans would have been branded as traitors for visiting the USSR and or China. Democrats, there just was no way, because Democrats, remember, were linked with losing China in 1949, and Democrats were linked with losing the Vietnam War hadn't happened yet, but losing Korea, or at least having the Korean thing happen. So Democrats were afraid to look too easy on China. But the thing is, and there's a phrase, only Nixon could go to China. Only Nixon could go to China, because anybody else would have been considered a communist for going. But he was so anti-communist, it wasn't a deal. But that's 8-9 years or so away. Remember the kitchen debate that I mentioned? Here you see the debate. Okay, there's the actual chairs where they debated. Nixon did not look good. He was sweating. Kennedy looked great. Let's see if this video plays here.
The election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln said the question was whether this nation could exist.
And then, you see Nixon just kind of looks uncomfortable there, the way he was sitting.
The spirit of Senator Kennedy has expressed
mustache,
the spirit of the United States
all that.
should move ahead.
He just looks skinny.
Where then do we disagree? I think we disagree on the implication of his remarks tonight.
And one thing, and Nixon never forgave JFK for this. Like I said, they had been friends, even though different political parties. JFK probably knew we had a plan to invade Cuba, but JFK put Nixon on the spot. Like, you haven't done anything about Cuba. We got this Castro guy down there, and you're doing nothing about it. And Nixon can't come out and say, but no, we got a secret plan to get rid of Castro and to invade. And so Kennedy made Nixon look soft on Castro, when in fact, Nixon's like, man, that JFK, he knew that. He knew I couldn't say anything, and he put me in that situation. But it was a big, big deal. Okay, and here you just see another picture of it, where they were sitting there with the reporters. Now, one thing Kennedy would do, okay, this is not in your handout, but it's good for AP. JFK was made aware, of course, that Martin Luther King was in jail from a protest he had been in. Now, they asked all the people, who are you going to support? Now, today, African Americans overwhelmingly tend to vote for the Democratic Party. I mean, it's 85-90. 95% they're likely to do it, believing that the Democrats care more about them. All right, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that is kind of how it goes. In those days, it was still a lot closer. All right, African Americans' votes were really up for grabs. Kennedy called Dr. King's wife, and he used his brother to get Dr. King released. Also, JFK said, look, as soon as I become president, I will open up public housing to African Americans with the stroke of a pen. Well, when he becomes president, he doesn't seem to really move on that very fast. And a lot of African Americans mailed him pens, writing pens saying maybe he doesn't have a pen, right? Kind of as sarcasm. And it's going to take Kennedy a while, but African Americans may have played a role in him winning. When we look at the results of the elections, and sorry, this has got the reverse colors that they used to use. Kennedy is in red, Nixon is in blue. All right. Now, you can see down here in the South that we're already starting to see some defections from the Democratic Party, the solid Democratic South. Mississippi completely goes for a segregationist by the name of Byrd. A good chunk of Alabama leaves, even Oklahoma, right? And this is kind of a sign of the times that the Democrats are going to start losing some of those white Southern votes. A lot of those white Southerners thought, particularly in the area of civil rights, that the federal government was going too far. If you ask them, they will say, I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me. In other words, it changed its ideas. Now, the thing is this, Nixon, of course, won California, his home state, but he also won, but Kennedy won Illinois and Texas. Illinois, it was very controversial. There are allegations even to this day that people in organized crime, who JFK's father definitely had an involvement with in his bootlegging days. That's what his dad had done and made a lot of money. And in the movie business, had helped get JFK, Illinois. And of course, JFK had picked a Southerner who we all thought was a conservative Democrat, right? By the name of Lyndon Johnson to be his vice president. If Kennedy doesn't win Illinois and Texas, y'all, he doesn't become president. Look how close the popular vote was, y'all. 49.6 to 49.7. But if you flip those, what is that? 51 electoral votes. You give him 51 more. You take 51 from him. We have Nixon as president in 1960 instead of 1968. All right, when JFK becomes president, y'all, he's sworn in. There you see his vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. The two did not get along well at all. They really hated each other's guts, as it turned out. But it was a super, super cold day. In fact, President Kennedy's lecture where he was about to speak caught fire. People thought there was a bomb in it, but there'd been a heater put in the wooden little podium and it had caught fire before he went up there to speak. But it was super cold. Now, this is one of the most inspiring inaugurations in history. I'm going to play just some bits of it for you, but make sure you guys know a couple of important phrases from it.
In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it.
Or our podium.
And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my
Here's the line.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
All right, that's the most famous line, but it's an amazingly wonderful speech. As good as FDR was, as good as Reagan was in his speeches, and as good as Obama was, nobody, I think, comes as close, at least in delivery, to President Kennedy. Lincoln's speeches may have been greater, but we don't obviously have any recordings of those. So remember those words. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Kennedy was great at flipping around things like that. Like one of my favorites is never fear to never negotiate out of fear, but never fear to negotiate, right? He could take a phrase and just kind of flip it like that. He also promised, it was a very kind of what we today would call a hawkish speech, as in like the bird, a hawk, because he talks about the threats to democracy around the world. And he says a line that a lot of presidents wish he hadn't said, and that was, we will bear any burden. We will pay any price. In other words, we'll do whatever it takes to make sure freedom and democracy wins around the world. Well, it's going to turn out that Vietnam was a little bit of too big a burden and too big a price for America to pay when we eventually lost almost 60,000 people and spent about $1 trillion there. And so, but it's a very, very famous speech. He talked about the torch had been passed to a new generation born in this century. And like I said, he's a young guy next to Teddy Roosevelt. He was the youngest person to ever be president of the United States. And a lot of young people got excited about it, and they would answer that call, right? Okay. So, domestic policy here. We're going to talk about the space race here in just a little bit. You know, Kennedy and his wife brought a really new style in. You know, they were wealthy. They dressed really nice. They called, or people came to call their time in office as Camelot, because she was like Queen Guinevere and he was like King Arthur. I don't know who Lancelot was, but maybe his brother. I don't know. But they had artists come in. They had the best fashions. Mrs. Kennedy redecorated the White House, and she invited people to come see it on national TV. She went and gave a tour of it. And so, you know, it was a whole new type of style that they had here. Now, the sad thing about what happens with Kennedy, and this is often forgotten, y'all, but you should note it. It's here. Kennedy makes a lot of promises, but he's not able to fulfill them. It turns out, despite his great speeches, he was not very good at getting legislators to vote like him. Lyndon Johnson is going to be much better at that, and is going to be able to get people to vote. And sadly, because of their dislike, especially his brother Bobby's dislike of Lyndon Johnson, they really didn't use his talent to get legislation through. So Kennedy, in the end, is more about what he promised, what he represented, y'all, more than he developed, because almost all of his achievements, except for the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Nuclear Arms Treaty, really happened with his successor, okay? Now, kind of like FDR, his thing was not to have, you know, like Eisenhower, all these rich executives working for him from private industry. He wanted the best and the brightest people in the country, your best professors to advise him. Turns out, as this says, some of that advice turned out not to be so good. Now, he does propose things like a tax cut. He does get the tax cut, but he also tried to get Medicare, failed to do that. He tries to get civil rights legislation, had it passed at the time of his death. More money to education, which he did get. Now, one thing he will do, as you'll see, he does get a Peace Corps passed, as well as something called the Alliance for Progress that does some good. All right. His closest advisor, of course, was Bobby Kennedy. You can't do this anymore. You can't have your brother advising you. We will see later, if we get to it today, that after Kennedy's death, his brother eventually gets and runs for senator, and eventually becomes sadly, also another victim of assassination while he was running for president himself in 1968. So 5 years separate these two men, both of them cut down by assassins. Here we see pictures of the family. Like I said, young. I mean, when's the last time a president had kids that young? I mean, Obama had some young kids, uh, but usually presidents have kids that are like 30 or 40 by the time they become president, right? But Kennedy really struck a young balance there. Look at the fancy tux, and she had the designer dresses, and people wanted to be like her. It was really an amazing time. They even adopted two Russian dogs whose parents had been into space. They'd been dogs that had been sent into space, and they gave the puppies. I always thought the dogs might be spies, y'all, for the Russians. Now, you should make sure you know what his legislative program was, which sadly most of it did not pass. It was called the New Frontier, and we see it from a speech that he gave while he was running for president. We stand at the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unfulfilled hopes and dreams. It will deal with unsolved problems of peace and war, unconquered pockets of ignorance and prejudice, unanswered questions of poverty and surplus, right? And so there you see that, okay? And some of the ideas here, right? Trying to increase minimum wage, more money for urban housing. Remember, cutting taxes, which is very unusual for Democrats, right? Remember, Democrats believe in priming the pump. If necessary, we take taxes from the wealthy and we give that money. If necessary, we use deficit spending, right, to try to bump the economy up. This has been what they've been doing since Franklin Roosevelt during the Great Depression. It's what, not so much Obama did some of that, but definitely Biden and Trump, both, pumped a lot of money into the economy because of COVID, right? Kennedy does so many things that he hoped to get done, but it turns out most of what he had to deal with was the Cold War, right? Which was fine with him. That's what he really wanted to be. Now, as it mentions here, this is one of his accomplishments that's still with us today. In fact, one of my best and oldest friends is considering joining the Peace Corps. That's how you pronounce that word, as you guys probably know. The idea here, as you can see, was to try to fight hunger overseas, fight disease, fight illiteracy. The idea was that Americans who want to serve their country, but they don't want to serve it, say, in fighting and killing people, if necessary, could serve their country by going over and helping people in other countries with American technology and American know-how. And it grew pretty quickly, 7,000 volunteers before Kennedy's death. It's still around to this day. Here you see some of the first people arriving, leaving the U.S., flying over to Ghana. Was one of the first places. That was in Africa, of course, they went to. And as you can see, and this is old, probably over 200,000 people have served in some Peace Corps country or not. And basically almost every country on the planet, Americans have gone. So that would be something you guys could bring up. The Peace Corps today is still around, like I said, doing work. Now, so what happens to this new frontier legislation? Well, most of what he wanted doesn't get passed. For one thing, he barely has a majority of Democrats in Congress. And you've got to remember, a lot of those Democrats are conservative Democrats, all right? They're not real happy with this Yankee Democrat who's talking about civil rights and stuff being in power. And so Kennedy felt like he needed their support for some legislation. So he was really careful. If he pushed them too far, say with civil rights, he might lose them for other types of legislation. Okay. So like it says, despite the myth that he accomplished a lot for minorities, it was really more his brother and it's more his successor that does it. And of course, Kennedy, and like I said, I absolutely love him. He's like my third favorite president after Teddy Roosevelt and after Lincoln and of course John F. Kennedy. But the thing is, they could be really arrogant, especially some of the young people he picked. Like, yeah, we don't need you guys to tell us what to do. We know what to do. And a lot of old people that had worked in the government were not really fond of this young whippersnapper telling them what to do. Now, this is a book you guys should write down somewhere on this handout or on notes separately. Michael Harrington, who was an American socialist, he died a few years ago. He wrote a book called The Other America. You just remember Harrington, The Other America. The big thing about this is he surprised a lot of Americans to talk about how many, a good chunk of Americans were poor. And, Americans don't like to think we have lots of poor people. We think that's something they have in other countries, right? And he said there was a culture of poverty that people just couldn't get out. And he said the government needs to do more. Kennedy, who was a speed reader, y'all, he read something like 1,300 words a minute. He could read a book every day of his life. He could read a book in a matter of minutes, y'all. He was a speed reader. He read this book, and he comes together with what ultimately Lyndon Johnson will do, what is called the War on Poverty, or part of course, the Great Society. So Harrington, I've seen him on AP Test before. You should remember The Other America, which both got Kennedy and Johnson. Now, Johnson didn't read a book. In fact, I remember him bragging to somebody that he didn't think he'd ever read a whole book in his life. Kind of sad. Now, they won't probably ask this, but one thing that surprised people, Kennedy really stood up to the companies that were trying to raise the price of steel. He thought this would cause inflation. He thought other steel companies would follow up on it. He thought it would hurt our effort for our defenses. And Kennedy, put a lot of pressure on them that they backed off of this. And so this impressed some people that he could, because American Steel, the company, giant company, U.S. Steel, y'all, was incredibly powerful. I mean, this would be like facing down Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, companies that powerful today, basically making them cave in to what you want them to do. It'd be pretty impressive to pull off. And this got him a lot of support that he could do that and hold inflation down. Now, ultimately, as you see here on the handout, the space race, the space race is what a lot of people, especially in our area, remember John F. Kennedy for, because it was his foresight to do it. Now, remember, in October 1957, while Eisenhower was president, the Russians sent the first artificial satellite to orbit. It was called Sputnik, as you can see up there. This was a big surprise. We thought the Russians were years behind us, but just like in the atomic bomb, they had really surprised us, although without spies this time. All it did was really orbit us, but very, very quickly, they sent up a dog in space. Now, the dog, Laika, was never able to return. They had no way to get her back. So eventually her orbit deteriorated and she burned up in space. I guess you could say she was the first hot dog in space. Sorry. Yeah, Mr. D, you shouldn't say that. Okay. Eventually, we began NASA to try to compete with this. Now, we got the Russians sent the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. They beat us at that. He made a almost complete orbit. And then finally, we sent Alan Shepard up. He just went up and came back down, about a 15-minute flight. We sent Gus Grissom up. He came back down. So we'd had about 30 minutes in flight when JFK, after talking to NASA and saying, look, I'm tired of us getting our butts beat by the Soviets. What can we do to beat the Soviets? They tell them, we can land on the moon, and they won't be able to land on the moon before we do. And so JFK goes before Congress and gives this very famous speech.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space. And none will be so difficult
or it's
or
expensive.
expensive to.
And so, of course, as you can see there, we do finally get to the moon. And nobody else has landed a man or woman or animal on the moon since then. USA, USA. Anyway, now, so Kennedy, throughout his whole 3 years, approximately 1,000 days he was in office, y'all, he pushes for the space race. It was very sexy, very exciting to push for the space race. And upon his death, spoiler alert, we really feel like, okay, we got to finish this. We got to finish it for Kennedy. And I'm of the opinion in some ways, had he not died, it might have been forgotten, because in my lifetime, we've had at least 3 presidents promise we would land a man on Mars. And we ain't even close to that yet. Okay. But Kennedy said, before this decade is out. And we got there, y'all, 5 months beforehand. 3 astronauts died, as you'll see, training to do it. We were in a rush. Turns out the Russians were nowhere close to going. Their rocket, the N1, blew up like 3 times, y'all. Now, one of JFK's big things was going around and pushing the space program. And he came to Rice University, right here in H-Town, Bayou City. It's about a year before his assassination.
William Bradford, speaking in 1630 of the founding of the Plymouth Bay Colony, said that all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulty, and both must be enterprise.
I've stood at that podium, man. Pretty cool.
With answerable courage.
There's Johnson.
If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred.
That was a hot day.
The exploration of space will go ahead. Whether we join in it or not, we mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it. For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon, and to the planets beyond. Our leadership in science and industry, our hopes for peace
and that's
security,
an important thing, are the spin-offs, y'all,
from
us going to the moon. Your microwaves, your calculators, your cell phones.
To solve them for the good of all men. There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
I mean, we would not have had anybody speak like that. Incredible, okay? Now, we did send our first man up into space a few months before that, John Glenn. That's mentioned in your handout there. John Glenn was our first American to orbit. I think he ended up doing like 3 orbits, and then he had a problem with this heat shield, and he had to come home a little bit early. Let's see if I have any rare historical footage of that. From the movie The Right Stuff, with great music from Mars, the bringer of war. Isn't that? Or is it Jupiter? That's the Atlas rocket taking on. A beautiful thing. Godspeed, John Glenn. I cry when I see that movie, y'all. Now, another thing that comes up you guys should be aware of too. This is one of the many spin-offs that you guys live with today as a result of the space race. Telstar was the first satellite to send a television telecast, right, across the world. Here we go. Let's see if this plays. All right, I guess it won't. All right. Uh-oh, it's spinning. Not a good sign here. It's the evil cursor of death. Now, the Russians, too, beat us with the first man to walk in space. In fact, he just died a few months ago, Leonov. But Americans sent theirs out without any problems. It was Ed White. All right, let's see if Ed... Suddenly, it's not playing any of my videos. All right, well, whatever. Now, I told you guys we were in a real rush to win the space race, and we were cutting corners. And three of our great astronauts, Gus Grissom, who had flown in Mercury, and Gemini, its successor that took up 2 astronauts at a time, Ed White, who'd been the first American to walk in space, and Roger Chaffee, who was a newbie, a rookie astronaut. A fire took place, and it burned them. And actually, they fortunately passed out through suffocation before any of the fire got them. And this was in a dress rehearsal. And we had to shut down the program for about a year while we looked at it and figured out our mistakes. And it was pretty shocking, you know, that 3 guys would die like that. But it shows you in how much of a hurry we were to get up there. Now, eventually we sent up Apollo 7, which just went up and orbited the Earth to test the new Apollo craft. But fearing that the Russians were going to beat us to the moon, but not having yet the lander, y'all, to land on the moon, we decided to do an orbit of the moon with men. And I remember this. This was right at Christmas. I was 5 years old for my Christmas, a little over 5. I was about 5.5 when this happened. And one of the Apollo 13 astronauts, James Lovell, he'd be in Apollo 13 later. And knock on wood, all 3 of these men are still alive today. They orbited the moon. And they took this famous picture, which became one of the best remembered things of 1968. They called it Earthrise. They made it into a stamp. And it was one of the few positives we had of that particular year. Now, finally, with JFK dead at this point by 6 years almost, or 5.5 years, America on July 20th, 1969, my grandmother's 73rd birthday. Let's see. Trying to remember if she was born. Let's see here. But anyway, our 71st birthday, we landed 2 astronauts on the moon. In the meantime, one of them continued to orbit the Earth. Okay, it's not letting me play any of my videos here. Let's see what's going on. This thing is acting really, really funky, y'all. Okay. I'm going to see if I can get it to play through it here.
2, 1, 0.
So that's a Saturn V rocket. The only part that came back was the capsule. And I apologize for being so small. I watched this live. We were moving to Mississippi, and my parents were rushing to get us to a motel, any place, so we could have a TV. And I remember they're like, you sit there, you watch this. This is going to be famous someday. And I saw Neil Armstrong get out. First words from the moon.
You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
First words from the moon, Houston. The Eagles are. There's Armstrong. They had a camera deploy to film this. He's not on the dirt yet. He's on the pod. He's standing right here. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. All right. And we see it here on the next slide. Okay. Like I said, I don't think any of these will play. It's just not liking it. There we see Armstrong stepping off. That was another picture done a little bit later because it's in color. And Nixon was president at this point, not Kennedy, right? Not Lyndon Johnson. And the astronauts actually talked to him. And on the side of it is this plate that has the name of all three astronauts. Only Buzz Aldrin is still alive. I've had the honor to meet Buzz and talk to Buzz a couple of times, but both Michael Collins and Neil have since passed away. But this was an amazing achievement. And then here you see the capsule. That's all that came back from that 300-foot tall spacecraft, y'all, was that capsule. And we were afraid, y'all, that they might have brought back some space disease. So they were kept in a trailer for some time to make sure that they hadn't brought anything back. Some other inventions from the 60s, for the first time, zip codes were added. If you see stuff before my birthday, you don't see zip codes. Also, a guy by the name of Engelbart, for a company that would be called, eventually that was part of Xerox, made the first computer mouse that you and I take for granted. Later, Apple will get that technology basically for free. And also the very first fax machine was invented by Xerox. Even to this day, when you say Xerox, that means to make photocopies, but Xerox were the people that pioneered